Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another exciting virtual tour with the Foss Waterway Seaport. I, of course, am your guide, Chris Stottinger with Pretty Gritty Tours, and we are celebrating the Kalakala tonight. What on earth is the Kalakala? Well, is it a California ferry? Is it an Art Deco Seattle sensation? Is it a whispered memory of days gone by? Wrong on all accounts. It is a phoenix. It is the very symbol of rebirth, and I'm going to hopefully prove that tonight. As always, I'm very excited to have you guys here, and if you have questions, please ask along the way. But the Kalakala is, without a doubt, one of the most iconic vessels of Puget Sound history. This is what it looked like in its heyday. It was, in fact, an Art Deco vessel used for the transportation of passengers and vehicles throughout Puget Sound. And the operation of the ship can be traced from the 1920s until 2015 in a variety of different ways. And then it vanished. As we trace that legacy today, I would like to encourage you to think of the Kalakala and what we can do better moving forward. And I think there's a lot of things, but what is the history of this ship? I'm so glad you asked. The Kalakala began its story in California, San Francisco Bay Area in 1926, where it was built as a double-ended steam-powered ferry known as the Peralta. It was named after a prominent family in the area, and the Peralta, as it was being launched from the slip out into the ocean, stalled. And all the old-time sailors like, oh, that's a bad sign. That ship is cursed. I assume that's what they all sounded like. And so the story of the Peralta, this ferry being cursed, was literally there from the get-go, from the very moment that it launched. And there was a lot to back up that credence. And whether you want to say that it was the curse of the vessel or just how it was over time, well, listen, you decide. The first thing that we can tell you definitively about the curse happens in 1928, 2 years after launching, where ballast tanks on board the vessel were not properly filled, and so the bow sank into the water. Waves crashed over the front of it, and 5 passengers were killed. This was not the only accident of the Peralta, but it was the main one. And so the Moore Shipbuilding Company, which had constructed the Peralta, was like, we're not so sure about this. And there was just a stank on the name of the ship from the very beginning. That culminated right here. The Peralta was tied up for the evening. Basically, oh wow, I'm trying to think when this was. It was really early into the career, and was tied up out there on the dock, and an arsonist set fire to the San Francisco docks. And it caught the ship on fire, burned the dock lines. The Peralta, now on fire, being engulfed in flame, just drifts out into the bay and then is burned to the waterline. By all accounts, not an auspicious start to one of the most iconic vessels of the area, killing a bunch of people, stalling in his tracks, and then, of course, being destroyed by a fire. But from those ashes, it was reborn. The Peralta was sold for a very small sum of money, I think $10, to a boat company up here in the Seattle area, and ends up just outside of, well, Kirkland, in the Lake Washington shipyards in 1935, where it is rebuilt. And it is designed to be something more than just a passenger ferry, right? So we go from the shipyards here. It finds its way up to Kirkland under the command of now Alexander Peabody, great name, by the way, who is president of Seattle's Puget Sound Navigation Company. And for $10, he gets this broken down hull and the absolute promise of something better, and turns it into the Kalakala, which, if you're not already aware, and I assume a lot of people are, because this is one of the most well-researched, documented, and beloved ships of the region. The Kalakala is Chinook jargon for flying bird. And it adopts this name, and I would like to speculate that a lot of it comes from the fact that the design at the time is representative of an aircraft. And you got to think of the region, 1935, right? This is a period of growth and expansion for the area. There's a development of technology. There are streamliners coming to the area. The Boeing company is making moves, like planes and development and technological production are happening in Puget Sound. And so as the Kalakala comes up, this Art Deco wonder, it not only is modeled after an airplane, but borrows a lot of technology from that time. And this is the first time that a vessel like this is constructed using electro arc welding instead of a riveting system. And it creates that smooth, polished, like chrome steel design with the nice circular windows. And then one of the things you'll see here, let's see if I can highlight it for you, is that the cockpit, like in airplanes, is set back a ways, providing this open viewing deck and then the signature double door entry onto the vehicle platform there. Bear that in mind, because while the firm design of Alexander Peabody, president of Seattle Puget Sound Navigation Company, is indicative of the future, it is also spelling disaster for the Kalakala right out of the gate. They are engineering its own demise into it. And like a Greek tragedy, the things that made this ship so iconic and successful were also its great undoing. Yes, it's just like, couldn't possibly have been worse for the Peralta. And then here we go with the Kalakala. So the Kalakala now is up in the Seattle area. It is an instant success in the region. The design of it is still something of a puzzle today. A lot of people take credit for it. And again, like Boeing companies, engineers, I think, get a little slice of the pie. The shipwrights and craftsmen from Lake Washington, the genius of Alexander Peabody himself, like all of it could possibly take singular claim. But I like to think that there is something in the process, in the ensemble, that leads to where we are today. Now, the Kalakala was undisputedly iconic and new for the time. And so as it embarks into the waters of Puget Sound, it's an instant success for the region and starts its career here as a passenger ferry in between Seattle and Bremerton. And one of the things that made it really revolutionary at the time was that the cockpit, the section here, was made out of copper. Because one of the concerns that the engineering team has was that it had so much steel involved in the construction of it that it might be a problem for the navigation, for the compass. This is a little bit of foreshadowing here too. Not only do you get to see a bit of that copper cockpit, but you also get to see the fact that this was the first vessel in the region that was registered to be using a radar system, pictured here. And that becomes more prominent later on. But let's take a look at the design of the newly built Kalakala. From the bones of the Peralta springs forth the Kalakala. And here's the things that are going to be interesting for you. So here's the passenger deck here. This is just above the vehicle deck, and it's got, you know, a main room. It's got sections here, as well as, if you can see it here, this back viewing deck. And then up here on the promenade deck is perhaps the most iconic part of the whole thing. It's the double horseshoe bar. And so when you look at this here, right, you've got the palm room on the back, bridge up front, again, recessed, set back onto the actual vessel, promenade up front, passenger station, and car deck down below. And right as you're viewing it for the first time, you can see this is a vessel that was designed to be eye-catching and to enhance the experience of the passengers. It was meant for you to be seen and to see and to experience Puget Sound and luxury and style, but they didn't necessarily think, what would be a safe and practical vessel? Which gives us things like this. The palm room was originally an open-air section for seating and dining on the promenade deck. And a lot of the early seats, these changed over time to more state authority benches. But in the very first days, the palm court was out by the stern and had wickered furniture, and then eventually gets replaced by more, I guess, like government style welded curved benches. But they always maintain this sense of like grandeur for the area here. So here's kind of where you can see where the future is going. But up on the passenger section here, the promenade deck, is the bar, the Double Horseshoe Cafe. And the Kalakala was the first ferry in this region, I think maybe in the whole of the West Coast, to have the cooking done electronically, right? This thing was a spaceship to the modern audience. And what the beauty of the Double Horseshoe Bar is, I don't know if you can see it as well in this, is that, again, you were here to see and be seen. So it's got the wait staff kind of in the middle section there, and then you are seated either looking across the bar with that buffer in the middle where the wait staff could be, or on the other side gazing into it. And so it provided additional space, but there was something just fancy and bougie about the whole experience as well. And that can't be overstated enough. What was remarkable about the vessel was the novelty of it. As the Kalakala set sail in 1935 out into the region here and operated as a passenger ferry between Seattle and Bremerton, it was in that era of sort of the final days of the mosquito fleet. You're still seeing ship transportation being absolutely essential to the region. Streetcars are just about on their demise. And this is that transition from this is an absolute necessity for travel to, oh, what if we did this with a little bit more class? And so one of the most important and lucrative jobs of the Kalakala was to actually serve as an entertainment venue. It didn't just do passenger runs. They would also do cruises throughout the area where they would pipe live music throughout the vessel from the Flying Birds. And then they would serve drinks. They would have parties. It was as much a nightclub in the 30s as it was a passenger vessel. And again, remember, this is just at the end of Prohibition. There is a desire to see this vessel succeed now because it is launched out here, conquering the Great Depression, showing that we can be stronger and something more. And so as the Kalakala goes around looking as fancy and future-facing as it is, it's an instant success throughout the region. It would later go on to be part of the Blackball ferry line, serving routes all throughout Puget Sound. Let's see if I've got my route map here for you guys. I've stashed it somewhere deep down in this whole presentation. But here we go. You can see a lot of what the like ridership for this was, right? So these are passengers waiting at the Tacoma Municipal Dock, and they're trying to get onto the streamlined Kalakala. And this was for a publicity trip. It was the last ferry ride across the Narrows, hosted on July 2nd, 1940. And all these people are going to celebrate the end of the ferry. This is now a world of buses and bridges. And yes, I will be talking more about this. This is a fascinating chapter in the specifically Tacoma, Seattle history, where electric streetcars were the main mode of transportation all throughout the region here, as well as ferries. And then to enhance the new roads and the buses, by 1938, the streetcars were destroyed. That scrap steel was picked up and then sold to Japan. And then it all came back to us at some point. Similar level of foreshadowing would have been really useful for this moment here. This ferry took people around underneath the Narrows Bridge in July of 1940 to be like, all right, guys, we're not going to need a ferry system anymore. And that was very exciting because up until the moment that the Narrows was built, people had to rely on ferries like this one to get across the Narrows on their way to Gig Harbor and the peninsula. And this one caught on fire and they're bailing it out. This was the other ferry. This was not an elegant or really luxurious vessel. This was just, we got to get across the Narrows. Let's say a little prayer that it happens. As the Kalakala rolls onto the scene, it's a disembarkation from the need to be relying on boats. And so they have a big costume party. Everybody parties the night away. They sail under the Narrows and away from it. And they're like, we're done with that. But then, of course, it collapsed into the sea, which I'm telling you, this would make an amazing HBO show or Greek tragedy, because all of the signs have been here, all of the hubris of engineering, and they knew that the Narrows was going to collapse, and they knew that the Kalakala wasn't going to survive, because there were early signs that this vessel had some big problems. And one of them was, yeah, you guessed it, the recessed cockpit, which, believe it or not, makes it difficult to see, oh, that's right, what's immediately in front of you. And so it's in service, July 4th, 1935. The first couple of years, they're having repeat problems where it is running into things. It runs into docks. It runs into other vessels. I think the most famous time that it ran into another vessel, when is it ran into another ferry, the Chippewa. If you're not familiar with the Chippewa, you might confuse it with the 1943 yard tug that cruises around Tacoma today. That is a different vessel. The Chippewa was the oldest ship in the Washington State ferry fleet, originally built in Ohio. I know, brace yourselves. In 1900, and then plied through the Great Lakes on a variety of missions, and eventually by 1907 came out here as part of the Puget Sound Navigation Company, where, hey presto, it was the ferry in the region here under state authority. This isn't to say that it was the oldest ferry in the region, but the oldest state ferry. And this is where there's some distinction. When the Kalakala first began, it wasn't a Washington State ferry. It was a ferry in the state of Washington. From the point where it was like a ritzy entertainment vessel, it then transitioned by World War II to be very much a work vessel, where it would take people from Seattle to the naval yards in Bremerton. And actually, around that point, they had to shut down the bar because the Navy boys were getting so ruckus back and forth that they're like, all right, enough. There's no drinking on board this. It's just a work vessel moving back and forth. And then by the end of that period, it became a Washington State ferry. And it worked with its new state seating, not as elegant, but certainly more affordable, throughout the region. And then it gets a radar system. And this is something that really should have helped the Kalakala more than it did. But there's this quote, which I want to read to you, where when they installed it, it said, "The ferry Kalakala's radar set can do just about anything but fry eggs or talk seagull talk." And I love that. It allowed this vessel for the first time to be able to see significantly better than it had been into that point. Did it stop running into stuff? Well, docks, not so much. Other vessels, very much so. And so its big debut onto the scene of success once more really happens in the early 60s when the Seattle World's Fair takes center stage here. And the World's Fair was all about this future-focused technology. The Space Needle is a brilliant example of that. Jetson era. What are we going to be able to do? What technology is going to save us here in the future? And the Kalakala was a signature piece of it. Some people say the only part of the Seattle World's Fair more iconic than the Space Needle. I would argue that the two of them together represented the biggest draws visually to the region. A 1930s Art Deco ferry and the Space Needle reaching for the stars. And they both had that sort of space feel to them, which when you look around old photos of the Seattle World's Fair, That was very much the vibe that they were trying to give off of what is the future and are we already living it? So the Kalakala continued to carry passengers throughout the region, beginning its time here as a schmoozy like event space, then going on to become a work ferry for the Bremerton Seattle circuit, and then eventually arriving at the time where it was all throughout Puget Sound. So we're talking all the way up to Victoria, Port Angeles, the San Juans. It was part of that blackball fleet that went all throughout the region. And because it had the bar and the entertainment space on there, it was really just something that people loved and adored. But the design ends up being the problem. Not only is that cockpit set back so far that it's difficult to see, but the opening, the hatches there. Let's see if I can bring up a good photo of that for you, which are iconic for the vessel, make it difficult to get the right kind of vessels on there. And from the 1930s on, you see an expansion in the size of vehicles. And so while the Kalakala could originally handle like 110 cars, by the time you're into the 1960s, I think they could handle 40 to 50 are numbers that I've seen of the amount of vehicles that could get on there. And that just wasn't competing with other ferries in the region that had been able to modernize. The weakness of the Kalakala was that it was very much of the era and incapable of adapting too much. But people still loved it because it was beautiful and provided a sense of nostalgia and wonder to the region. And for that, I think it needs to be celebrated and lauded. The installation of a radar system, totally awesome. The addition of it to the Seattle World's Fair, great. But more than anything, the sort of sense of wonder and grandeur that it brought to the area is what it really provided in spades. And in my opinion, hot take here, I don't think the Kalakala should have been left on the water. I think by the 1950s, they should have run that sucker aground and turned it into a swanky nightclub restaurant. Do what you will with that. But here in Tacoma, we had Top of the Ocean, which was a restaurant built by shipwrights that was never ocean going, right? It was built on pylons in the water and never was a vessel, but it was looking like a vessel from the very first days. Here was the Kalakala, which had always served as a vessel, but I think should have been a restaurant nightclub. Those were the things that it excelled at, dominating the skyline, being a music venue, a dance club, a costume party, and of course the double horseshoe bar with all of its electric cooking available inside. I know, it's just what I'm saying, like, is my thought on this. Also, welcome. That would have been a sweet job to be part of the legacy of the Kalakala here. And I don't think you can technically say that the Kalakala was part of the Mosquito fleet. It was at that end of the era. I guess you could make the broad, like I don't know that there's a definitive list of the vessels that comprise the Mosquito fleet. I think the Virginia 5 today is considered the only remaining part of the Mosquito fleet, but it's definitely like, it's in that era where we were attempting to figure out what transportation would become. The Kalakala for 32 years was on Puget Sound, and I believe over 31 million passengers were served on that vessel, both as passengers going from one point to the other, but also as people just there for the entertainment. Survived the Great Depression, survived the World's Fair in 1962, and just saw its own limitations start to tighten the noose. So by the 1960s, there were multiple red flags about the aging infrastructure of this ferry, and so people were concerned that it was not going to be able to keep servicing the region. And when they put in the new engine, when Peabody redesigned it, it was a single engine stern instead of the double ender like a lot of ferries, and it shook. The design of this vessel was such that when it was heavy underway, the whole thing rattled really aggressively. It just was not meant to be a vessel at sea. Was it the curse of launching poorly, or was it just that they were trying new things on an experimental vessel? Maybe both things are true. But by 1967, the Kalakala was auctioned off to an Alaskan fish packer, and for $101,000, or 101,551, I guess if you want to be specific, the new owners converted it into I believe it was for packing crab originally. They took this vessel, this absolute icon, and gutted its interior and turned it into a crab packing facility in Alaska. They could float around and can crab on a whim. And this is the part of the movie where like you're really depressed. We're like 3/4 through. You're like, I don't know if this is a tragedy or a comeback story. This could be $1 Million Baby or it could be Rocky. We don't know yet. And the Kalakala, now a floating crab packing plant, is up in Alaska and continues, even in this moment of absolute tragedy and sorrow, to serve and fail. There was an incident where it ran aground and they just shoved it into the dirt. And so now it is converted. Here's the picture I have. It was up here as a crab cannery in Alaska and then beached in Kodiak in 1970. And when the Kalakala was beached in 70, they started processing shrimp inside of it. Here's another equally depressing. Yeah, there it is. So here's the Kalakala just beached as a shrimp processing facility in Alaska, being destroyed in the winter by snow and raked in the summer by sun. And this is you would think perhaps that this would be the saddest moment in there. But no. Okay, here we go. Thank you for this official answer. Mosquito Fleet was the private industry ferry system that failed and eventually became the Washington State Ferry System. And I appreciate that, because my understanding of the Mosquito Fleet was that it was a hodgepodge, mismatched collection of non-centralized ferries that operated throughout the region. I didn't know that they had a central banner. Yeah, it is sad what happened to the Kalakala. And guess what? It gets worse. It's a $1 Million Baby story. After the Kalakala serves as a shrimp processing facility, it is discovered by Peter Beavis, who saw the resting hull of this ship on a fishing trip up to Alaska in 1984. And with the knowledge that the internal structure of this was rapidly deteriorating, but could be reworked to create something new, he buys the vessel and has it brought back down to Washington. And oh man, they weren't sure what to do with it. I think there was a moment where they filled part of the interior with cement and drywall, and then it even had ceiling tiles for a moment. All of these negotiations go through, money is exchanged, and back to Seattle, the Kalakala returns in 1998. And instantly controversial. Like when you see this, you could either see the return of a glorious champion, or you can see an aging eyesore crawling along the shores. And the Kalakala was not prepared to be a seagoing vessel again by any means. And it was going to require, my assessment, an amazing amount of money and time to refurbish this. So the Kalakala ends up in Nia Bay, where everybody in the region is like, get it out of here. We don't want to look at it. Either turn it into the restaurant like we've all wanted, or shove off. And through even more controversy, the Kalakala eventually finds its way down here to Tacoma. It has a safe haven for a moment. I think it was in the Foss Waterway here, and then it changes hands again. So the Makah tribe had been sort of giving the Kalakala shelter out by Nia Bay. It gets evicted. The Makah tribe, I believe, bring a lawsuit against the owners, and so the Kalakala limps down here to Tacoma, where for a long time it just sat pondering its existence right here on the edge of the port. And in 2008, the Kalakala owner at the time, Steve Rodriguez, made some big announcements to get additional vintage ferries, restore them, and then use the Kalakala as like the flagship of this, and then power it with wind power and solar powers, or to use it as a museum. And again, in my personal opinion here, one of the problems with this was that there was this dream that the Kalakala could go back out and be a vessel. Instead of letting it retire, come up on shore and using it for something else, there was this belief, this desire to return the Kalakala to the sea, to let that bird fly once more. The funding never materializes. And once things get to the point where it's a legal battle, the Kalakala is evicted from its space. The Coast Guard does an assessment of it and determines that this is not only an aged, decrepit vessel, but is entirely unsafe and shouldn't even be in the water. They declare it a hazard to navigation. They give a laundry list of other issues to it. And so I think this was in 2015 that this picture was taken. They set a deadline for the owner to repair it. That deadline goes by. And so the Kalakala is dismantled, taken apart swiftly and brutally. And all of those pieces get sold for scrap, sent away for trash, and only a handful of them remain in the region. And I'm trying to see if I've got the picture that shows what was left. I don't know if I do. If you go, I'll share the link to it later, but Kirkland, the Kirkland area, ended up with the largest pieces of the Kalakala. And they have a diagram that shows, the ship and then the pieces that were saved. And it's part of that topmost deck, and then just a few other, the doors, and then a few of the windows. And in fact, the Foss Waterway Seaport currently has this piece of the Kalakala, one of the windows from the main passenger deck there, and are receiving additional pieces of the Kalakala, I believe, tomorrow. So they are about to rework their exhibit on the Kalakala. They're receiving more pieces of it, and they're going to be telling a lot more of the story of this vessel and its service throughout the region, and then allow you to actually see it. And for me, going to the seaport, one of the most magic parts is when you get up close to it, I feel like you can see, like a core sample, the history of this vessel presented here, with that steel side, the chrome plate, and then the layer that goes on top of it, and the rust, and the time, and the patina, and just the layers of the years that this vessel served. Again, you can trace its timeline either from 1935 to 2015 as the Kalakala, or you could say from 1926 to 2015, because first as the Peralta, that vessel down in California, it really was first cursed, right, by not coming out and then killing a bunch of people, and then by coming back up here. And it maintained that ballast system. One of the things that was interesting about the days of the Kalakala ferry is that it had a ballast system that could be filled on either end. So if the bow was heavier, like when people went to walk off of it, they would fill the ballast containers at the stern of the ship to balance it out, and then they would release them to get the draft of the ship back to where it needed to be. I'm so conflicted about the Kalakala story. I'm obviously a huge proponent for the preservation of things, but I genuinely don't think that the Kalakala should have been a ship for as long as it was. I think it needed to come back out of the water. And it was such a boon to the area and the region because of what it provided to the area, and because it was a draw that provided a unique landmark and something to hold on to. I would love to see something like it come back to the waters of Puget Sound. I would like to see ferries in the area be modernized at all. So I think there is a lot for us to learn from the Kalakala story. And I don't know that it is, if at first you burn down, try again. Maybe it's, if you keep burning down, learn to improve. Learn from your mistakes. As I've been told my whole life, every education has its tuition. I feel like the Kalakala just kept paying its tuition and never graduating. So now the burden is on you, my friends. What can we take away from this vessel, other than there is a beauty that could enhance the region if only we can make it safe and functional simultaneously? So, yeah. Oh, yes. There are some. I was gonna derail myself earlier. There are some phenomenal beached ferries throughout Puget Sound, and yeah, one of my favorites out on Anderson Island has a very similar history, where built somewhere else as, I think it was like a naval yard ferry, took people out to torpedo production, kind of like the one that's out by Point Ruston today. And then they bought it. These two guys bought it because they were looking to improve the ferry system from Steilacoom to Anderson Island. They sailed it down the East Coast, through the Caribbean, through the Panama Canal, up the West Coast, and then into Puget Sound, where it was deemed not really necessary by the ferry authorities. And so it's just been beached on Anderson Island. And again, you could do so much with it without it being a functional vessel. I think there's always something where ship people really want ships to be ships, but sometimes, if we learned anything from Top of the Ocean, it's that you shouldn't get involved in organized crime because your restaurant will get torched. But if there was a second lesson in it, it's that sometimes something can look good and be very good at what it does, even if it doesn't look like it's the thing that it should be doing. That was a convoluted way to say, let it be a restaurant. There we go. Whew, what a voyage tonight. I hope you guys have enjoyed this brief introduction to the Kalakala, and I hope that you go down to the seaport over the next, I think it's going to be probably the next couple weeks that they really get that up and going. But the new pieces of the Kalakala should be arriving to their collection tomorrow, and they'll be taking new pieces out of the archive and displaying them in context. So go salute one of the great vessels of this region and remember its history, and use this as a pivot point to do better, my friends. Let us do what we can. Hot damn. All right, my friends, until next time, I'm Chris with Pretty Gritty Tours, and here tonight at the Foss Waterway Seaport, bringing maritime history to life just for you. If you have questions, leave them in the comments, and I'll see you all soon. Get on out there and keep on exploring.